Tonight I'm going to talk about anxiety and how we're all suffering from it at the moment to some degree, and what we can do to help ourselves heal this fear pandemic as much as the virus pandemic that we're suffering. And a lot of the content is taken from two of my books, The Scar That Won't Heal and Losing Our Minds. So those are the two main books that I'll be drawing on here. And Claire did mention a little bit about me, but just to give you a bit more detail, my first degree was in biochemistry with pharmacology. I've done a master's in nutritional medicine. I used to work at Southampton University as a health researcher, and now I've turned my hand to doing therapy, and I particularly work in the field of trauma release. But my PhD is in the traumatic components of chronic pain, which I'll allude to during this presentation. And contact details for me will be repeated at the end, so no need to worry about that right now. Okay, so just a quick outline then of what I'll be covering tonight. So I'll be looking at the different types of anxiety because they're not all the same. I'll be looking at the features of the stress response in the body. The purpose and features of anxiety, because it does have a purpose, it's there for a reason. We'll be looking at triggers in everyday life, which of course this pandemic is one. The neuroscience of what happens in the brain and why that's important. And then how you can heal, which is the most important thing, how you can reduce that anxiety level through the body. And then, as Claire said, the final bit will be a little bit about the specific anxiety we're all going through at the moment, and there should be time at the end, either before or after Clap for Carers, for Q&A. Okay, so types of anxiety then. Well, the first type is the obvious one, situational. So in other words, it's normal acute response to something that's going on in your life at this time. And I used to give ordinary examples like exam stress or a driving test or something like that, because a pandemic constitutes a severe situational stress, so definitely forms that type. But there's also more chronic types of anxiety, and these two can actually interact. So if you happen to suffer from generalized anxiety, that's been given a name now, generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, or something like bipolar disorder, used to be called manic depression, or even, postnatal depression, which can be chronic and long-term for some women. And then there's a third type, and that's to do with an unconscious response, so sudden and uncontrolled. So things like panic attacks. You get a lot of people being admitted to hospital before the virus took over. You would often find a lot of people in A&E with heart rate, atrial fibrillation, breathing difficulties, and it would just be considered something to do with a stress response, and they'd be sent home. Other types of these sudden uncontrolled anxiety attacks could be flashbacks, which are very interesting. They tend to flood you with a sensation of a time that's gone, because you've been unconsciously triggered. And this is normally related to some form of unprocessed traumatic memory, something that happened to you a long time ago that's been consciously forgotten, but is reawakened by the situation that you're in some way. And of course, there are many things at play here. Hormonal dysregulation can also upset your brain and cause you to be more easily triggered as well. So, and toxicity, we mustn't forget our environment at the moment is, luckily we're in a situation where there's a lot less toxicity right now, but in general, a lot of pollution, dirty air, dirty water, and dirty food. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the stress response, and there's a scientific term which I wanted to introduce you to, which is the HPA axis, and HPA stands for hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals, which are a little chain of organs, glands, and tissues that sort of communicate with each other in a feedback loop. Hypothalamus and pituitary are in the brain, and the adrenals are, they're two little glands. You've got a left one and a right one, and they sit above your kidneys. And so they are your first line stress response. So this HPA axis, I'll be referring to it a lot, but it's good to know because it's the first line defense of your body to a stressor, something that wants to shift it out of homeostasis, which is balance, basically. So stress is anything that departs from this balance in your body. And it's a neuroendocrine. In other words, it's neuro, meaning nerves, and hormone response, all coordinating together. And the two main hormones that I want you to know about are cortisol. Cortisol is normally a balance to adrenaline. So adrenaline speeds your heart up and makes your pupils really, really dilate because you're trying to address some threat in your environment. And cortisol is meant to come along and reverse all that and calm you down again. And as I say, this whole coordination is meant to be smooth and balanced, but sometimes it goes awry. And then you've got the autonomic nervous system, which talks to your hormone system. Obviously, the nervous system starts in the brain, so the hypothalamus is part of that. And autonomic simply means automatic. It goes on behind the scenes without you having to think about it. So your breathing will speed up or get faster, or it will slow down, and your heart rate will change, and your blood pressure will change, and your liver will be filtering, and your kidneys will be filtering, all behind the scenes. And it's the autonomic nervous system that controls that. And it has an incredible level of complexity, and it's really interesting to note that there are three basic levels that it operates with. The first is what we should all be in now: rest and digest. Hopefully we're all relaxed, we're all enjoying each other's company, we're glad to see each other because we haven't been able to meet for a long time. It's what's called the social engagement system, and it relies on facial expression, voice, prosody, eye contact, you know, the nice smiles that we all give each other, when we're in physical contact, the hugs that we give each other. So it's all sensory, it's touch, sound, sight. And that's the state that you would like to be in most of the time to be happy and healthy. But there are two further states which may need to come into play should a stressor come along and disrupt that nice, relaxed state. And this level, the next level down, is called the fight and flight system, or sympathetic nervous system. And that's really for mobilizing you to engage with the threat. So whatever the threat is, if it's, you know, you're about to be chased by a lion or something and you want to run away, or somebody is about to attack you and you need to defend yourself, that's what the sympathetic nervous system does. And it speeds your heart up, and it gives you adrenaline, and it makes you able to fight, and you get incredible amounts of strength when that's engaged properly. But sometimes that doesn't work. And if we look at something like a virus, which is invisible, we can't see it, it's unpredictable, we don't know when or if we're going to get it, we can't really fight or flee a virus. It doesn't work. And the same is true of a bad relationship, or bullying at work or school. And so there is a third level which comes into play if that one does not produce the required result. And this is one that most people don't know about. It's the freeze response, which is a very ancient system of parasympathetic nervous system that's really meant to prepare you for death. It kind of slows everything down. All your energy functions become very low. Digestion is affected, brain function is affected, you get very brain foggy. But it's meant to be very temporary and a last resort to actually put you into a state almost of hibernation. And those three levels, you can move up and down the levels. It's like a ladder, really. You can be moving into fight and flight and then go back down to freeze, or you can be in social engagement with occasional forays into sympathetic. something goes awry sometimes with certain people, and it certainly did with me. If you have certain experiences in your life which have, I guess, made you more sensitive to stress, you can get stuck in the lower two levels, and you never feel safe, and you never feel relaxed, and you never feel calm. And this can be called sympathetic dominance if most of the time you feel agitated, like you should be doing something, but you don't know what to do. And that's the state of anxiety, basically. And it can be absolutely crippling because there is no obvious way out. There is nothing to fight or flee because it's hidden, it's unconscious. And we see people often with obsessive compulsive disorder who develop these repetitive behaviors that are meant to sort of calm the nervous system. And so you can get very stuck in those. And social anxiety is another example where the trigger then is going into an environment where other people are, and you feel instantly like your nerves are on edge and you can't bear it and you need to get out. But there are also conditions where freeze response becomes the norm, and the habitual response, and you get stuck there as well. Things like chronic fatigue syndrome, which is just so common at the moment. I mean, it's really everywhere. I work particularly with chronic fatigue sufferers, and a lot of them have said to me, well, this coronavirus thing, this is life as normal for us. Isolation, yep. You know, we don't go out, we can't go out, we don't see other people, nobody knows that we're there. And so honestly, it's really like being in a state of freeze the whole time. Some of them can't even raise their head off the pillow, and certainly walking and normal life is completely out of range for them. Now, the other thing you might see, though, is the cycling between those two bottom states, and bipolar disorder, I believe, is exactly that. It's usually when you get depressed and low and you can't move, and then you get these occasional bursts of mania. That's going into fight and flight, but you never feel restful, you never feel calm. And this, as you can imagine, is a problem. So just to understand then what anxiety is, I think it's important to note that your subconscious brain, the parts of your brain involving the brain stem and the limbic system, are the ones that control this autonomic response. And because they're not conscious, you're not aware of them, you don't know what's happening when they're being triggered, because they're really about survival. They're very ancient parts of your brain that are there to notify you of danger and predict what's going to happen in order to help you avoid the problem in future. But they're developed over many thousands of years to respond to acute threats, the kind of situational threats that I talked about in the first slide. And when you have a chronic situation of threat, then it's very difficult for the limbic brain to switch off, and it becomes hypersensitized. Now, the other thing that can threaten us is a problem with attachment. And you often find people who are highly anxious had attachment issues from childhood. Attachment is the natural psychological bonding that should go on between a parent, usually mum, and the child when you're very, very young. So from birth through to, you know, when you start to go to school and start to interact with your peers. And attachment is very, very important for how you perceive the world. And if it doesn't go according to plan, it doesn't work out to be secure, in other words, and that's about 70% of us, by the way, who are insecure. When something threatens us, we react really strongly because we've had that as a baseline since we were little. And it could be that the parent was not safe themselves, or they were not emotionally available to us and didn't give us protection. So sometimes it's not what they did, it's what they didn't do. Or perhaps they were addicted to some substance themselves, or they were chronically ill, which was my situation. And so attachment, which should be like a natural bonding between parent and child, does not come in early enough, and it doesn't become embedded in the brain. And so the brain learns to fear more than it learns to feel safe. And this is what often triggers people in later life when other stresses come along, and stresses are cumulative, of course. So this attachment problem, where you either have threats in childhood or you have protection not available, both are considered traumatizing. And I'll go on to talk a little bit more about what trauma is and what it does. So anxiety then is the body's way of drawing attention to something unhealed. And what's normally unhealed is emotional trauma. It's emotional. And thus anxiety isn't in itself the problem. It is the body's way of trying to highlight the problem. So it's a symptom, not a disease. And that's where I think modern medicine has largely failed us in terms of it medicates the symptoms, but it does nothing to approach the root cause of anxiety. And if you imagine that anxiety is like an overreaction, it's like a habitual, programmed, learnt response to stress, that the limbic brain has learnt, you know, these things are dangerous. This is what I do when I'm stressed. It's a childhood coping strategy. But if it's not unlearnt or it's not calmed down in adulthood, you end up coming from the reactions of a scared child all the time. And I can assure you that's definitely how I am some of the time. It's like a landscaping of your brain, and it causes you a lot of problems with relationships, with your health. There's nothing it doesn't really affect. Because, as I said, this response is prioritizing survival at all costs. So it's not interested in the quality of your relationships. It's not interested in how well you can digest, as long as you can do it minimally. It is largely about keeping you alive so that you will not be eaten or you will not die. But if that becomes chronic, it downregulates all your essential systems, so that you're doing no more than surviving, really. You're certainly not thriving. And there's a part of your brain in the limbic brain called the amygdala, and that's really like the warning light or the smoke alarm. And it's a tiny little organ shaped like an almond, hence the Latin for almond is amygdala. And in fact, there are two, there are a left and a right. And they fire off when threat arrives, like we've had in the last few weeks, to tell you and warn you that danger is ahead, and you end up feeling all these feelings and emotions that you don't really know what to do with. So why do we have anxiety then? It's really unpleasant. It seems really unfair. Well, remember, it is trying to keep you alive. It's trying to perform a function, a warning function. And adverse childhood experiences, which happen to a lot of people, they're very common actually. We used to think they were only the most serious things, like, you know, abuse or being kidnapped or something. But actually a lot of children grow up in households that are not safe. And so adverse childhood experiences are a massive part of why we get anxious, because they overstimulate the brain, and the brain talks to the body via the autonomic nervous system, and they create this hypersensitivity, what's called hyperarousal. You're always on alert, and your system is ready to fight and do what's necessary. So it's in what's called sympathetic dominance. Now, what happens over time is that although the HPA axis gets kicked into touch and things start to happen, if you keep stimulating your adrenal glands too much, then you run out effectively of your adrenal hormones, and particularly cortisol, and you get low cortisol. And these two, cortisol and adrenaline, they work in balance. So if you get low cortisol, you don't have any inhibition, because one turns on the response, that's adrenaline, and cortisol turns it off. And if you don't have enough cortisol, you're permanently on. You're just hyped and very stressed a lot of the time. It also has a very important function, cortisol, in immunity as well, which I'll touch on when I talk about COVID-19. So a lot of us are in fight and flight a lot of the time. The other thing that's worth noting is toxicity, and how the brain, being actually part of the body, it sits in the body, it's connected with the body, it has blood supply, it has a lymphatic system, actually picks up if our bodies are toxic. And there are so many sources of toxicity out there at the moment. There's obviously what we eat, and there's a lot of chemicals in the food that we eat, unless we're strictly organic, and even then we find that there are, unfortunately, pollutants there. Electrosmog, very prevalent at the moment. Obviously, we are increasing in our access to electromagnetic radiation from the kinds of things that we take for granted, smartphones, all the new electrical gadgetry that we have that talks to us and communicates with us. And if we're not sleeping well, which can often be another problem, chronic insomnia, because you know, we're toxic, we can't clear our brains overnight, then actually this toxicity directly affects our attention, because our brains can't work well. And so we lose focus and integration. Integration is the way that the brain talks, the different parts talk to each other. And when we lose integration, we become very disconnected and reactive, instead of our brains kind of working things out in a calm way. So all of those things play a part. And current events, of course, are really what overlays over the top of those things. So if you have, for instance, a chronic illness, you've suffered a bereavement or a loss, you have financial worries, you're worried about what's going to happen after the, you know, this virus is starting to work its way through the population. These are considered triggers. They are triggers to an already stressed system. And what a trigger is, and I love this, it's a little quote, it's a psychic explosion that crashes through avoidance, because most of us avoid our emotions hugely, we suppress them. And it brings that, you know, dissociated or avoided trauma suddenly back into consciousness. And that's where we get these little floods of feeling, which is panic attacks and heart palpitations and those sorts of things. And they're not conscious. We don't know what they are. We're not aware of what the historical trauma was. We just know how we feel, and it feels awful. So I have mentioned that. If you're interested in ACEs, there's a huge amount of literature on that now. It's become a really big buzzword in the research community at the moment. And it's informing schools, prisons, social care. We're looking now at the importance of ACE, because it actually determines your life course. It's not just a psychological issue, it actually determines your health and well-being over your life course. And the literature is fascinating. I mean, it increases your risk of cancer, for instance, 2 to 3 times, your risk of autoimmune disease, lung diseases, all sorts of things. And most people have a few ACEs. So they have things that, like if you had a depressed parent, or you lost a parent young, illness in the family, that sort of thing. If you're interested in doing a survey for yourself and finding out your ACE score, it's really interesting to do. I mean, I think mine was 3 out of, I think it's out of 9. So I don't have a massively high ACE score, but 3 out of 9 is moderate. So I've mentioned already attachment, and I want to look a little bit about repressed emotion as well. So failures of attachment, so this is that bonding between parent and child. There are 3 main ones, okay? Betrayal is really, really important. So where somebody did something that you were not expecting, that actually feels like a threat to your sense of self. It's such a shock to the system. It leads in a child to a feeling of self-blame, because basically a child is very narcissistic. They think everything's about them. And if a parent or a loved one betrays them, they will tend to think it's their fault. And so a lot of self-blame comes on from betrayal. The other one is abandonment. You're left without support from the very people who are supposed to look after you. And that's a very common one as well. And a death can be perceived by a person as abandonment. So it's not just always that they left you. And the third one is humiliation. And I'm sure we've all had examples of humiliation. I know I have, and they live on in my psyche. Childhood ones particularly, you know, being humiliated in front of the class when I tried to do joined up writing and had my workbook thrown in the trash by a very irate teacher. I can still remember that one, and I'm sure you all have examples yourself. These are all relational traumas, so they induce shame, and shame is a very complex emotion that tends to live in the body, and it bursts through every now and again in certain behaviours, because we tend to, as I've said, we blame ourselves, and it attacks our sense of self and our self-esteem. So we tend to think of ourselves as not good people, and our self-worth suffers. But other emotions that might lie underneath anxiety are repressed anger, guilt. These are probably in order of commonality, actually. Anger is the big one, particularly for women. Women don't feel it's acceptable to feel angry. Guilt is another big one, and sadness, which we repress because we don't want to feel it. They're unacceptable to us and to the psyche particularly, and they create what's called internal conflict or a conflict shock. And what the brain does with that is it diverts that emotion into symptoms, usually anxiety, but also sometimes into fatigue or pain. Just a note about betrayal, by the way, it's not always just in love relationships, it's in any relationship that's important to you, and the childhood ones are the worst, because that's when your brain is still immature and it's still forming and it's still trying to make sense of the world, and it's growing in response to its environment. And shame, as I've said, is one of the worst and most difficult emotions to highlight because it doesn't announce itself. But it changes your behavioral responses. You know, where we're seeing a lot of it at the moment, actually, you know, how dare you do such and such because I know better than you. That's shame, okay? I'll talk a little bit about social shaming at the end, but there's a lot of that going on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at the moment, and it's not healthy. So features of anxiety then, just other considerations are this, it's related often to blood sugar control as well, and people who eat large carbohydrate meals will often find their insulin is spiked and then they don't have enough cortisol to balance it, and so you can often you feel worse when you've come down off a sugar high. It's also, interestingly, usually worse in the morning. That's because a lot of people normally over the rhythm of the day should be that cortisol is high in the morning to get you going, but where you're exhausted adrenally, cortisol doesn't rise until the end of the day, and so you feel really shaky because adrenaline has overtaken, and so you feel really bad first thing in the morning. You can actually be woken up with anxiety as well. It can even peak 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, because your sleep cycle starts to get really disrupted when all these hormones aren't working properly. And adrenaline is pumped out to keep your blood flowing while insulin has done its job and taken sugar out of the blood. And your organs need blood flow during the night because that's when they do their major clearing and detoxifying. And so the body pumps out more adrenaline. And so you can actually get woken up with anxiety as well, which used to happen to me. Still does occasionally. Then when you're not sleeping well, of course, you get more panic stricken because sleep is such an important part of feeling good. And if your sleep has not been restorative, then the body actually registers that as a threat too, because it detects that you're more inflamed. Inflammation is the natural response to threat, and lack of sleep is considered an inflammatory threat. So it becomes a bit of a cycle, and you start to worry because you feel bad, and then more worry develops more stress hormones depress your sleep cycle, and you enter into what's called an anxiety loop. And a lot of people get very stuck there. More symptoms, more worry, more symptoms. So a little bit then, we touched on it earlier about the brain, but I want to go into that in a bit more detail. The neuroscience of anxiety is that emotional trauma is deemed by your brain to be more dangerous than anything, because it equates to the threat of annihilation. So if you've been humiliated, betrayed, abandoned, you've lost a loved one, it feels like to your brain that you are going to die. It's that serious. And so it triggers this response in your limbic system, and you become hypervigilant, as I said, you know, looking out for threat everywhere. And it's emotional because it's to do with the bonding. You need other people to survive. And again, we're seeing this occurring a lot in the response to the pandemic. So you've got this smoke alarm going off, the amygdala is firing repeatedly and sending alarm signals to the rest of your brain and body. Your HPA axis wakes up, and with the pineal gland, the pineal and the pituitary actually. Pineal is more to do with your sleep-wake cycle, and pituitary, well, that's another story, but they're all working together to regulate your well-being and your sleep-wake cycle, which is sometimes also called your circadian rhythm. And so if that gets off, you start to feel worse and worse. You've got certain chemicals in your system, in your nervous system, called a neurotransmitter, and the most important ones are noradrenaline, which is produced in your brain, serotonin, which is you've probably heard of because that's the one that's supposed to make you feel calm and relaxed, GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, is another calming one, and melatonin is the one that actually wakes you up or puts you to sleep at night. So these all get out of whack, and so your sleep is affected and your brain fails to clear. It doesn't do its detoxification at night. This is new information. We didn't know that the brain had a detoxification system, but it does. So sleep is really, really important. So this new information that we now have, because we've been able to scan live brains, is that we have a lymph system in the brain called the galymphatics. It's a combination of the galymph and lymphatic. And what it is glial cells in your brain, which are little helper cells that help clear out all the toxins in the fluid around the neurons, are actually draining overnight. So when you're sleeping, that's what's happening. So all the toxins are draining out of your brain, ready for a nice, refreshing sleep. And when you wake up in the morning, your brain feels sharp, you know, or should do. Doesn't always happen. And sleep quality is something that most people aren't aware of. They think that if they sleep 7 or 8 hours a night, that's fine and that's enough. But quality refers to the way that your brain goes through a certain number of cycles of different types of sleep. It's not about the length of hours, just. Your brain needs different types of brainwave activity overnight. It needs dream sleep, which is otherwise called random, I've forgotten, eye movement, rapid eye movement, yeah. And it also needs non-dream sleep or non-REM sleep, and it needs to go through these repeating cycles 3 to 5 times in order to do the job. And that's directed by melatonin from the pituitary, which I mentioned earlier. And so here's a EEG of your brain, and you see the wake readout is very different to non-REM alpha, which is when you start to get drowsy, and then you go into non-REM theta, which has these little spindles every now and again. That's non-dream sleep. And then through to stage 3, you've got another slightly higher amplitude brainwave until you go into dream sleep, which is very particular because it has this readout, and it also allows your brain to process memory. That's what it's for, to filter out, like clearing out your mental attic, throwing away things that you don't need. And then there's the gut and diet, and that's something that most people don't realize has a huge impact on the way they feel in their brains. We tend to think if we have a gut issue, yes, it might be dietary, but if we have a mental issue, most people wouldn't think naturally that their gut might be involved, and it usually is. They're actually in communication with each other through the nervous system and also through the bugs that live in your gut, the microbiome, which actually produce a lot of the neurotransmitters and chemicals that feed directly through the bloodstream into the brain and tell the brain how you're feeling. Now, stress and anxiety really have a very big impact on your gut. They also have an impact on the immunity, because your immune system is in your gut. The first line part of your immune system is in the gut lining. And so gut and immunity are just one and the same thing, really. And what we now know is that we have a new term called psychoneuroimmunology, which means what you think and how your neurology works, how your nervous system works, impacts your immunity. And so we can't think of the mind and the brain and the gut as separate things. We have to actually think this is a mind-body issue, and they're very, very connected. So high carbohydrate diets, we've already talked about blood sugar, they inflame the brain and tend to create all sorts of problems in the brain, including long-term things like Alzheimer's and dementia, which has been referred to as diabetes type 3. It's like diabetes of the brain. And they're so common. You know, what have people been panic buying recently? Pizza, pasta, canned goods, you know, really, really high carbohydrate foods, because they give you an instant buzz, but then you get this horrible dip and inflammation. Ideally, what we need to turn to is good fats, because our brain works best on these things like olive oil, nuts and seeds, because the brain actually needs to burn fat more than it does carbohydrate. It can function on glucose, but it's better to work through little conversion products of fats called ketones. And when we reduce our carbohydrates and increase our fats, we can go into what's called ketosis, mild ketosis. And that's where we're relying more on fats to burn, which is more efficient, actually, than carbohydrates. So don't forget, there's this two-way communication between what we're eating and how our microbiome is feeling from that, and what information our brain is getting. So it's this sort of two-way communication. And it's the microbiome, or the bugs in your gut, that are producing most of the feel-good neurotransmitters. So your serotonin, about 75% is produced in your gut, and your GABA, remember, that's the other calming hormone. And so in order to actually promote that, some supplementation can be needed. And I've suggested here one supplement that really works if you've got really bad anxiety. But don't forget also probiotic or fermented foods, you know, things like yogurt, kefir, kombucha are really vital, because we've stopped eating those things. We don't preserve foods like we used to. We tend to rely on freezers now instead of pickling and bottling. So we need to add those into our diet and try and restrict carbs as well. If you're interested, actually, the supplement that I've recommended there, L-theanine, is very useful for reducing the incidence of respiratory tract infection. And I thought you might be interested, given what's going on in our environment right now, to reduce your risk. And if you're interested on what happens in the brain and how to change anxiety dietarily, then both Trudy Scott and Kelly Brogan are really good people to look up. They have amazing websites with loads of information. They've both written many books on the subject, but they're really well-researched people. So they thrive on good science. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Yeah, we're okay. So conventional treatment then for anxiety. Generally, we're looking at you know, pharmaceutical medicines, things like antidepressants, antispasmodics, sleeping tablets, those sorts of things are generally the first arm of modern medicine, but they will often have a worse outcome, believe it or not, than doing nothing. I know you're going to be very shocked to hear that, but I've scoured the research here, and it really is true that most issues of anxiety will heal themselves if we allow ourselves to really feel what we need to feel in a supportive atmosphere. And that's the really important part, really. If you're in a difficult relationship or you're under constant stress, then yes, it's going to be very difficult to allow yourself to feel what you need to feel. You need to be in a supportive relational context. And the problem with a lot of these antidepressants particularly is withdrawal. And we see that some people get completely stuck taking what should be an acute medicine for years and years and years. And as soon as they try and taper down or come off, because there's nothing else to support them, and their neurology has got completely changed by these chemicals, it can be a real issue. And there are ways to do it healthily. And Kelly Brogan, again, has a really good protocol that she helps people go through to come off. Now, the other thing that might be offered to you is a combination of psychological talk therapies like CBT, or sometimes the new one is dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. But there are often long waiting lists. You might be recommended to go to a group therapy session, like a stress management group, but very bad for people who have social anxiety, because the one thing they really don't want to do is go into a group and talk about their problems with strangers. So it works for some people, but it's limited. Oh yeah, that's actually the study that I was mentioning earlier that said that you have a worse outcome on medication than you do if you don't take it. So if you're doubting me, that's actually one to look at. Okay, and Kelly Brogan for the protocol for withdrawing, tapering off gradually, because you should never, never, never just stop taking something. It's really difficult, and it's traumatic for your body, and you need to do it in combination with your GP, of course. And now here's something I just wanted to cover quickly, because so few people talk about this, although it's becoming really interesting in the light of COVID-19, that there are huge gender differences in response to stressors. Now, you probably know this, but you may not, that women are twice the risk of anxiety and depression. And it's something like 9 to 10 times the risk of chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and autoimmune disease. They seem to have much worse long-term health outcomes from these kinds of issues. And the reason is women to men, women are physiologically quite different, quite apart from the fact they're able to, you know, get pregnant. They have smaller organs. This is something nobody talks about when you talk about dosaging, for instance. You know, a man and a woman will be given the same dosage of antidepressants, for instance, regardless of body weight. And that can be a huge burden on female organs because they're smaller. They're about a third smaller, in fact. And so they're doing double duty on half, well, 2/3 the output. And that's a stress. Women have higher estrogen, men have higher testosterone, and estrogen encourages autoantibodies, and testosterone depresses the immune system. So we think this could be related to why men and women are responding and having different effects from the virus at the moment. So yeah, so testosterone is an immunosuppressant. So women tend to mount a stronger immune response, but they tend to also get more autoimmune problems because the immune system becomes over-responsive and starts to attack its own cells. Women tend to also, in stress, they don't have testosterone to push through on, and so they tend to rely on adrenaline and cortisol more, and hence they get fatigued is one term, or certainly dysregulated, adrenal dysregulation. And this problem is that then cortisol runs out. Low cortisol then promotes more inflammation, and so again you get this cycle. of poor responsiveness and inflammatory cycles. But as I've said, women do tend to have better cellular immunity, which is called the Th1. Don't worry about the technical terms, but they're better at fighting viruses, interestingly. But viruses aside, this autoimmune problem means that a lot of women end up with chronic long-term disease more than men do, although men do get them, and all of us suffer to some extent, but it takes 20 to 30 years to produce a recognizable disease. So it's not an immediate response. And as I've said, stress on its own downregulates immunity. So the more stressed you are, the less your immune system is able to respond sensitively to what's going on. And then the second difference is neurological. So we've looked at the physiological differences. Now we're looking at the neurological. Now the amygdala, remember the amygdala is part of your limbic brain. It's the smoke alarm, gets less inhibited in women. So we tend to be more anxious because our thinking brain, the cortex, doesn't overrule it so well. So men, and these are, you know, they're on a spectrum. There's many anxious men and lots of calm women, I know. But in general, women tend to be more emotionally reactive because there's less inhibition of their fear triggers. So men are more likely to get depression and women more likely to get anxiety. But that, as I've said, is a sweeping generalization. Now, why that might be is boys, as their brains are growing, tend to grow more nerve cells, more neurons in early development compared to girls. And there is a theory that that tends to give them more capacity, if you like, more spare to crowd out any dysfunctional or difficult memories, traumas. And so they may not remember them as well as girls do. And when puberty hits, and what normally happens in the brain is the brain gets rid of a lot of excess neurons, and that's called pruning, nice term. Boys have more spare to balance out, and therefore they don't suffer perhaps quite as much emotional trauma. But they do tend to act out more because of a part of the brain called the cauda nucleus, which is the inhibitory violence and aggression part of your brain. So they tend to be more angry, more likely to lash out. But I really want to say emotional sensitivity occurs in both boys and girls. And there is a term called the highly sensitive person, or HSP, and there's a lot of information about this. It's about 30% of the population. Those of us who are highly sensitive know we are, because we tend to be affected by things in our environment much more. We're very aware of atmospheres in a room, whether people are happy or not. We love music and art, and we're very sensitive to things, but we suffer this high sensitivity generally. And I am coming nearly to the end now. So how to diffuse anxiety. You can change your diet, obviously, and that's number one, I would say. Exercise more in natural daylight. We all need to be doing this. I know there are limitations for some people who can't go out at the moment, but if you can get into light, you know, go on a balcony, get out into your garden. It's really important to exercise where you're getting natural light, because that's where vitamin D, which is a really important hormone, it's not even a vitamin, it was misnamed years ago and it's too late to change it. It's a hormone, it's an immune regulator, and it's made in the skin in reaction to sunlight. The other thing is getting comfortable with the fact that you suffer with anxiety. So not getting anxious about your anxiety and seeing it as your problem or your shame. It's trying to teach you something about what lies underneath rather than harm you. Trying to reduce the stress response. This is very difficult for most people who've become habitually stressed. But there are things you can do, you know, taking yourself out of the environment that is stressing, calming yourself in ways that you've found to work, and coming to acceptance with a safe other. And that can be a pet, it doesn't have to be another human being, but certainly getting out into nature and interacting with safe people, people who don't trigger you. And then maybe finding out what lies beneath, and that needs to be done very gently and carefully with somebody that's able to support you through that. And that could be a partner, it could be a friend, it could be a practitioner of some sort. So not forgetting the good diet and the supplementation that you will also need in tandem with that. You can also do things like journaling, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, reading, chanting. There are lots of things you can do. But the main thing, honestly, is connection and meaning. Having meaning in your life, having good friends, having community. And that's really what the bookshop is. It's what my involvement has been, is to try and promote that. They're a community bookshop, and it's more than a bookshop, as you've always said. It's about having meaningful interaction with others that feels safe. Other things you can do, find yourself a safe place to explore your inner workings, to readjust your nervous system. This is really key. And you'll find that there are exercises you can do which stimulate what's called your vagus nerve. Things like chanting do that, drumming does that, being in nature and grounding yourself, being in contact with the earth. Hearing someone calm as well. And when you're watching these videos online of people in great distress, whether they're in A&E or they're just talking about how bad it really is, that can be very triggering for some of us. You need to learn to notice the positive, and we can do that. We can start to train ourselves to lean into the positive and prepare for change as well, but make an effort to notice positivity. And so that's where you'll start to write things down. Because our brain has what's called a negative bias. It will always notice bad things more than it does good things. And when we notice good things, our prefrontal cortex comes online, and that's the bit of our thinking brain that helps to de-stress the anxiety and turn off the limbic survival brain. And I use a lot of methods to help people do that, which I could talk to you about. I'll probably talk about that in the questions. I think we should break now. Do you? Yeah, and then I'll do the remaining part after the clapping for carers. So 5 minutes or so, I guess.
That sounds perfect. Thank you so much, Patricia. That was amazing.
Okay, really brilliant.
Good. Perfect time to take a break as well.
Shall we pause it? Yeah.
Yeah, lovely stuff. We'll see you all in a minute.
Brilliant. An undercurrent, I would say, of the need for compliance to kind of, we've all got to somehow come together, but the ways in which that's playing out with some people is the social shaming. And I've seen an example of that today actually on Facebook, with somebody saying, my neighbor went out to get a newspaper today. Well, that's hardly essential, is it? You know, and it's like we're pitted against each other to compete for these limited resources. And for some people, because they have probably attachment problems of their own, shame is in them, so they wish to shame others to kind of avoid their own. And so I think that's why social shaming is coming up. And we're also seeing a lot of variable, let's say, policing. You know, some is needed, of course, where you've got people having big parties as if nothing is going on in this world at the moment. But, you know, also we're having normally law-abiding people being stopped and questioned, which is very triggering for people who've never before had that kind of interaction with the police. And so there is this uncertainty and all sorts of strange events going on, which are playing out through this fear pandemic. And what's happening for all of us then is that our survival brain, or the limbic system, is taking over. And that's what we saw in the first few weeks with all the panic buying. Remember, survival at all costs, survival of the fittest. And you've had situations where people were taking a packet of eggs off the shelf in front of old ladies, you know, like snatching it away, because it really is embedded in our survival brain. I've got to survive against you. Since the lockdown, we've had a lot of extra stress from the loss of structure or meaning in our lives for some people. I mean, obviously if you're in, you're looking after people in intensive care, obviously your job is just stressful anyway. But for those of us who've lost our jobs, or our jobs have been taken away temporarily or permanently, this, you know, uncertainty of where we're going to be when, if the virus goes or comes to a level that we can control it, we're in a state of deep anxiety over that. And it's especially bad, I think, because of the lack of social connection and contact for our children, particularly teenagers, I think, who live for their friendships, live for their friend groups. You know, peer relationships are the most important when you're in your teenage years. And the elderly, and my mother's elderly and stuck at home, and I can't go visit her, and she has dementia. It's very hard to explain what's going on, but I know we're all suffering that to some degree. And that has stopped working. I don't know why. Hang on a second.
Anything I can do?
I don't know. I might have to pause the recording.
Okay.
Oh, we've got somebody waiting to come in. A bit late. Right. So I was saying that we had a lot of stress and anxiety from what has happened through the lockdown. But what we're also seeing, and we've just taken part in, is a lot of altruism and community that's coming together. But it's largely bottom up, note. It's spontaneous arisings of connection and the need for a community spirit. And it's coming mostly from people wanting to do that, rather than government telling us, you know, we will have a clap for carers every week. It's been largely driven by social media as well. But just to note that, you know, while we're doing that, we are aware that the government response has been a little mixed, let's say, and, you know, some staff are still lacking basic protective equipment, and we don't have a clear exit strategy. So I'm not going to get too political here, but each government is doing it slightly differently, and so that adds to the uncertainty of what's actually going on and what the correct response should be. And the data just isn't there at the moment. We are seeing what's happening in China, and we're sort of noticing it, but there's a bit of let's say understandable doubt about how the Chinese measure some of their data, and so we're still not really sure how we're going to get out of this situation. And I have noticed also that debate on this has been to some extent shut down. The opposition and really not debating it at all, because they've been going through their own leadership, you know, election and so on. And so we've actually been subsumed really with this overwhelming amount of data on deaths and cases, and we're not looking perhaps at the bigger picture of what we're going to do to get our social structures back, to get our economy back on track. And are we going to do it differently? Because that's a big question, you know, which, you know, it's philosophical, but I think we need to look at. So certainty is something we don't have right now, and certainty is one of the 6 human needs. And we all need a balance of uncertainty, certainty, security, challenge, and I can't remember what the other 2 are. But we basically, all human beings need this. And when we don't have the balance, we tend to feel very anxious, and it really does feel very disabling in our bodies. It's felt in the body, not just in the brain. So we have no consensus right now of what to do and how we're going to get out of it. And by the way, the coronavirus emergency bill was rushed through Parliament, and I do urge you to have a look at it, because although it's supposed to be a temporary measure, it is set to be around for 2 years plus another 6 months for review, and it does give huge new powers to the police, to the legal system, and forced vaccination as well. And of course, that may be of issue for people who have reason to disagree with vaccinations. So What can you do then in these troubled times to help promote your health? Ensure a news blackout if you have high anxiety, because I really think the more news you follow, the more anxious you're going to get. For most people, we need to limit it and not be watching the rolling news, the 24/7 updates, because they're simply stimulating our stress response the whole time. We don't have a chance to come down and rebalance. Trying to find some form of routine if your normal routine has been completely disrupted, and doing one productive thing per day. Having a focus, in other words, so that our thinking brain can start to plan and do what it does best rather than taking over the anxiety loop. And connection with others, which is what we're doing here and what my yoga teacher is doing and what everyone's doing right now, is trying to relocate what was a one-on-one environment of connection to an online environment. Even if it's virtual, it's still connection, and it's really, really key to mental well-being. And as I've said before, getting out in the sunshine. I mean, I saw somebody rowing this evening out on the drive, which I think is, in a rowing machine. It's a really good idea to get natural daylight because of the link with vitamin D and your immune system, particularly the upper respiratory tract. So getting connection with the earth and the sea as well, touching the ground without gloves or rubber soles. We really need to feel the earth and get connected with it. And the nutritional support, particularly for COVID-19, would be a low-carb diet, high phytonutrient foods, in other words, coloured foods. Anything that has a great colour is usually full of phytonutrients or plant nutrients. There has been quite a lot of research into high-dose vitamin D and C. You will see it. It's not really accepted in mainstream medicine, and a lot of medics have been on saying, there's no evidence. The evidence is very, very strong, but the trouble is they're not taught nutrition, so they don't really know this. And you do need to have certain other minerals as well to make that work properly. So I would say, just as a preventative, just, up your vitamin D, get out into sunlight, increase your diet of coloured foods, and take some supplementation as well. In addition, if you start to get symptoms, and I may have had it, I don't know, I definitely had a really sore throat for about 3 or 4 days a couple of weeks ago. I just went straight online, what can I do, and found a salt inhaler, because I'm very much into natural medicine, and you can buy these things. There's a picture down on the right there, that you fill them with sea salt, and then you add a few drops of iodine, and you just inhale, and that goes into your respiratory tract, and it lines the epithelial, that's the skin layer on the inside of your lungs and throat, and helps repel viruses if they are in there. If you do happen to get even sicker and you get the second stage of the disease, which is the secondary bacterial infection, sweet wormwood tincture is supposed to be really, really good for that. Now, I don't know the full evidence of that. I do know that the French have been using it, but it's not widely publicized, because of course it counters the pharmaceutical approach, which is what most hospitals are doing at the moment. Obviously, I'm not saying don't go to hospital if you need to, but these are things you can do at home that may prevent you having to go to hospital. And just a note, we are seeing this, actually, it was in the news today, that this is affecting ethnic minority, dark-skinned people much, much more than white people. We're seeing probably, it's a 30% increase on what we'd expect given the population proportions. And so dark-skinned people need even more vitamin D because they make less in the skin. And vitamin D in the winter is usually very low for all of us, which is why a lot of these viruses tend to hit us in January, February and March, when our vitamin D stores are at their lowest, because we've had no proper manufacture in the skin since October. Because in the UK, we only make vitamin D in the skin between April and October. So, and that's to do with the wavelength of light and living in a northern latitude. So really important, it helps to prevent the secondary infection as well, vitamin D. So it's just such a super important and dead cheap thing you can do to raise your own levels. Just as a note, when I went to the GP, mine was something like 28 nanograms per litre. I had a vitamin D test and they said, you're normal. But they're judging it on a baseline low level. Actually, optimal would be 50 to 80 nanograms per litre. And so I was obviously very, very low. And so I hope I'm better now. I haven't had a test since, but I am supplementing. Vitamin C, you can take fairly high doses, certainly a lot higher than the recommended daily allowance or RDA. And you need much higher doses if you do suspect an infection, so up to 10 grams a day, but you have to limit it to what works for you. You get diarrhea if you take too much, so as soon as you've got diarrhea, you know you've reached that limit. But it helps fight the sepsis, which is another part of the condition that kills people. It has been used intravenously as well in hospitals in New York and China. So, but you can take it orally. Oh yeah, and sweet wormwood, I said, was used in France. It's an anti-malarial, and you know Trump has been very keen on finding chloroquinone, which is it's a pharmaceutical anti-malarial. All right, so there are things you can do. If you want to find out more about natural health and healing, you can contact me. I've got 2 websites. One's sort of more educational and the other's more therapy. And my books are available for purchase through October Books. First one's The Scar That Won't Heal, which is all about trauma and the stress response. The World Within, which is all about gut, diet, and the microbiome. Number 3 is Losing Our Minds, which is about healthy aging. And the final one, which isn't out yet, but will be and available for pre-order, is Life Illuminated, which is about the bioelectric nature of the human body. So thank you for listening. If anybody is interested in contacting me for either the books, or if you want an online consultation, I do everything online, always have done. So it's not that I've gone to online, I've been doing it for about 5 years. I can help with anxiety, trauma, OCD, cravings, addictions, chronic fatigue. Pretty much everything is helped by coming to terms with your emotional traumas. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'm also a fibromyalgia CFS-ME practitioner, and I've written a course for practitioners on ACE-aware training, so looking at childhood experience. So that's me. I think that's it. October Books, they can deliver. They're amazing. Support them, please, because they're a wonderful bookshop and a wonderful bunch of people. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Trish, so much. I think if we unmute it, can we unmute everybody? I think there might be a round of applause in the in our audience.
Clap for talkers.
Yes.
Thank you. That's nice. I haven't thought about that.
Yay!
Any questions? That's the main thing.
Need to mute everybody again.
Yes, I will. Apart from me.
We've got 4 questions so far, and the first one is from Pauline, who has asked, is the production of hormones, e.g. melatonin and serotonin, affected by age?
Most hormones decrease with age, just because the body gets less efficient at producing them, and also we tend to get sicker and more toxic as we get older because our detoxification systems tend to get less efficient, and so everything tends towards getting less regulated. So it's not always that they decrease, it's that they're not in balance with each other, if that makes sense. Melatonin is an interesting one because actually it's made through light, through the top of the head. The pineal gland sits at the base of the brain, but it's between the 2 hemispheres, and it's sensitive to light. And what tends to happen as we age is the pineal gland actually calcifies and becomes less sensitive. So that is one that definitely decreases. But you see it also with thyroids. Women particularly tend to suffer autoimmune thyroiditis. And because females are more hormonally driven than men, there's a lot more potential for dysregulation, although men do get obviously low testosterone and the andropause and all of those things. So there are issues, over aging. Aging is a really interesting thing, because we tend to think it's a natural degradation, but it's not always the case, and you can intervene and change it. And that was the subject of my third book, the one, Losing Our Minds. It was how to intervene to make aging better. I hope that explains it.
Has that answered your question, Pauline? Oh, just unmuted you.
Hello, Pauline.
Yes, thank you. It does, and it's very helpful to know that what I think I'm experiencing is what is, rather than what I imagine it might be. So, if that makes any sense at all. So,
yes,
thank you very much. Thank you.
No, I think we all need to be empowered. We're being very disempowered right now, as are governments, by experts who are really, yes, they do know more, but they know more in a very narrow area. And that's what's happened in medicine, is that you will go to an expert who will tell you their bit of the puzzle, and the real expert is you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's your body.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm all for empowering the individual to understand what's going on. That's why there's a lot of science in my books. You know, I don't make any apology for that. I want people to know what's going on and why they feel the way they do. And then the next step is, what can I do to change that? And
is that covered in your book?
It's covered in all my books, but
okay, great.
Definitely The Scar That Won't Heal is the title refers to it. What happens in childhood is a scar, if you like, and without any intervention, it tends to just stay dysfunctional. And so it's all about how to intervene and what to do to actually heal that.
Were you good to go to question 2? Michelle has asked, do you think that with social shaming there is an element of peer pressure to shame?
Yes, I think we tend to follow others. We look for cues to others, you know, because of we're born to connect. Our brains like to connect with other brains, whether in person or virtually. What we believe is happening tends to inform our brain is what is the normal way to respond. And so I think when one person starts social shaming, we tend to sort of think, oh, I must look out for that too, and find out, you know, people in my area that are not conforming. And so we all start to do it. And it takes a critical voice. It takes a discernment to know what's appropriate and what's not. You know how irate we were all getting over Brexit, whether you were pro or anti, it's all disappeared because it's no longer relevant. Because it doesn't matter, because this is a far greater threat. So it's what's relevant and important in your environment that your brain will take cues from. And I think that can be quite contagious, actually. I think there is a contagion of social shaming going on right now, and we need cues from above. We need good leadership to say, yes, we all need to be responsible. We need to do the right thing, but we don't need to shop our neighbour for, you know, doing something that might be essential for them if it doesn't put anyone else at risk. That's my belief, anyway.
Does that answer your question, Michelle? Might be. So, hang on a sec.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, that was brilliant, Tricia. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's perfect.
I think we're all looking to each other for cues here.
You ready for a next question?
Yeah.
From Claire, saying, what do you think the role of imagination and creativity are in reducing fear and anxiety?
Now that's an interesting question. So I use the power of the imagination, because when we are looking for fear-based cues, we're using our imagination, but we're using it in a negative way. So we're looking for, I wonder what that means. I wonder what the next terrible thing is going to be that's going to happen. And our subconscious brain, which is the basis of our imagination as well as survival, is coming up with all sorts of disastrous scenarios. So what we have to do is use our imagination in a positive way and take back control. And I use a lot of imagination-based audio, otherwise called hypnotherapy, but it's really imagination-based work, where I allow the back brain to create future scenarios that are calm and peaceful and connected. And it's so important. And you can get that actually through drawing, through art, through anything that involves play. And I didn't have a chance to go through polyvagal theory, but when I was talking about the 3 levels of the nervous system, you know, the top one was rest and digest, or some people call it I can't remember, but they have another a phrase for it where it's sort of about connection. And in order for that social engagement system to be operational, you have to feel safe in your environment. Otherwise, you will never be able to be creative. And that is why a lot of people have lost their creativity over the years. You know, they might have had it when they were young, they were full of ideas, they were open to the world, and then life kind of intervenes and shuts that all down. They feel threatened, they feel overstressed, and creativity and imagination just decrease, unfortunately. But if we can feel safe in an environment and supported, we can reawaken that part of our mind again and start to find a creative solution to where we are right now. We surely need it. It's we can't do this through logic alone. You know, we have to think bigger.
That's great. Thanks, Trish. That's, yeah. I know there's a lot of sort of talk about, you know, what positives can we have out of this current situation. So it's just great to know that there is neurological and physiological impacts of trying to think positively. And
there is a phrase, what fires together wires together, right? So the more you think certain thoughts, the easier it becomes to think those thoughts, because your neurological connections fire easier. So if you constantly think negative and fearful and anxious thoughts, they become easier and easier to think. And so the only way to break that cycle really is to start intervening and thinking or creating new sensations around hope, connection, generosity, gratitude, which are all positive emotions which fire up new neural networks which overwrite the fear-based ones.
Brilliant, thank you.
We've got a couple more questions and a couple of comments as well.
Okay.
Then we'll have to think about tying it up, if that's all right with everybody. So we had a question from Michelle saying there's been a post circulating around Facebook about needing to eat alkaline food to fight the virus, as it's not supposed to live in an alkaline body. What do you make of this?
Okay, that's a really, I've seen that one actually, and I've seen the medical response to that, which is that you cannot change the alkalinity of the body. You can't change the pH balance because it's controlled in very tight, you know, range. That's true of the bloodstream. All right. If you go out of pH balance in the bloodstream by even 0.2, you will go into organ failure. So there is, however, a cellular pH that I think is what is being referred to, and what modern medicine doesn't really recognize, because it tends to think of the body as a set of organs, because it thinks in terms of specialties. You know, you've got a hormone problem, or you've got a back problem, or you've got nervous problem, but the body doesn't work like that. It works in systems, and the primary part of the body that is at the base of all those systems is the cell, and the cell has to have a certain pH balance in order to function well. And we do know that diet is a major impact on cellular pH. But as I say, it's not recognized medically, and you therefore don't go to your doctor and talk about changing, you know, an alkalizing diet, because he or she will laugh at you and say that can't be done, and it's absolute rubbish. But what I will say is these theories have been around a long time. This is a natural medicine idea that sort of goes back thousands of years, and I think it's got a lot of good ideas in it. I just think there's no magic solution here, and we have to be very careful that there's not one answer to this. You know, that if you suddenly juice loads, you're going to be avoiding the virus altogether. I think we've got to attack it from various ways and keep healthy, keep positive, do what we can to avoid contact with other people right now. But yeah, diet is a huge component of that, and making sure you're drinking lots of vegetable water, which is alkaline. Lemon, funnily enough, alkalizes the body, so lemon juice in water in the morning is good. But you know, it isn't going to be the only way that we're going to avoid it. I think we've got to also counter the stress response as well. So I would say yes, but it's not a magic solution. It's just one way that you could intervene and change the body to be healthier.
Did that answer your question, Michelle? If you want to unmute so we can say yes. Oh,
Yeah, that's cool. Brilliant. Thank you.
perfect. We have a very quick question from Pauline saying there was a reference to an HSP test. Where would I find it?
Yeah, if you look up the work of Elaine Aron, A-R-O-N, she wrote the book about, she's written several on the highly sensitive person. And I think if you go to her website, there's an HSP test, but literally if you Google it, you come up with dozens of different sites that have the HSP test on. But it's something like when you go into a room, can you detect an atmosphere, or are you affected by bright lights, loud noises, smells in the environment, you know, petrol fumes, those sorts of things. They're just classic HSP signs. Some of us are just tuned more highly.
Did that answer your question, Pauline? If you want to unmute yourself before you say yeah.
I am unmuted.
Did it answer your question?
Mm.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And a comment. Oh,
I've just done it now.
Yeah.
Final two questions are from Red Fraggle, who's asking about kids and teenagers. So question number one is, do you think there will be an increase in borderline personality disorder due to kids and teenagers being kept inside with abusive parents and no access to outside affection? Her second question is, should children be having to be homeschooled with when stress and lack of sleep and poor diet are detrimental to concentration?
Oh, okay. Well, tackling the first one, I think we're going to have a lot of unintended effects further down the line when lockdown is released, whenever that is. I think we're going to have a lot of mental health, anxiety issues, including BPD.
She's written a book, Patricia Worby.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
someone's yeah. So the second question was about poor diet, being homeschooled. Was that it?
It was, the second question was, should children be having to be homeschooled when stress and lack of sleep and poor diet are detrimental to concentration?
Right. Well, that kind of ties in with the earlier question, really, or comment, is that we're all in unprecedented territory here, and a lot of parents are not teachers, you know, and they're not trained to do this kind of work, and to assume that all families are functional and happy places is just contrary to everything I know, because I deal with hundreds of people who say, you know, my childhood wasn't abusive, but it was this, this, and this, you know, and it had all these things in it. And I think if kids are not getting enough sleep, they're not eating well because their home environment perhaps isn't as good as their school environment was, then I think, you know, we do have a problem that we need to look at. And I am hoping that when lockdown is released, that it's the children they release first. But of course, there is a real big question mark over whether that will then reinfect the population and we'll have another surge. So, but I think it's the children, not very young children so much, but it's the older children who are suffering the most right now in terms of total disruption to their natural state. And yeah, we can't control that. We don't. There are some very dysfunctional families out there, and school was probably their sanctuary, you know, and now that's been taken away. So again, I think we have a really big issue of uncontrolled experiment right now. It's a completely uncontrolled experiment. We've never done this. Nobody's ever lived through this. And I do expect to see difficulties further on from this.
Did that answer your question, Red Fraggle?
Yeah, it did. Thank you very much.
Perfect. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, I think we don't know what we're doing here, honestly. Our government, despite everything they put out, the letters and the charts, and, you know, this is new territory for all of us. And I think we're going to see huge social change after this. I think the NHS, looking on the bright side, I think the NHS is going to be better funded from now on, don't you? So anyway, should we end there, I think, Amy?
That's all of the questions answered. There are a couple of comments within the group chat if you want to glance your eye over them, but I have said that questions are closed for now.
Okay, so yeah, I can look at chat maybe later, or you can send them on to me. I can't seem to find them at the minute.
That's fine.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody, and please support October Books. Great people, great bookshop, virtual at the moment, hopefully not forever. It's been a pleasure, and we'll say goodnight. Thank you.